So, good morning, I'm delighted to be here. I think that was a nice introduction from Kevin that I'm going to try and connect to accessibility, but it might be a little bit tangential at times from traditional notions of what that is, but I think that's what I'm here to, that's what I'm expected to do, isn't it? So that's good. Just by way of introduction, I guess a little bit of background about myself, but also about the other protagonists in my talk in a minute. I can't see the screen on here. So I'm a design lecturer at DJCAD, Duncliffe Jordanson College of Art and Design at the University of Dundee, where I teach interaction design and product design students as part of an academic group that we call Social Digital. But I also do practice-led research that's nearly always disability related, and I guess the other way of describing it is it's becoming increasingly about the nuances in disability related design, and they're quite diverse. One of my projects is looking at the nuance of tone of voice, of speech technology used by people who can't speak through augmented communication, and the other is looking at the nuance of materials selected for prosthetic hands. But it's nearly always nuance involved. But before I went up to Dundee to become an academic, I was a design practitioner. So I was working for a consultancy called IDEO in London and San Francisco. I'm getting that presumably is speak louder rather than. Okay.
No, you're doing awesome, but.
Yeah. Two thumbs is awesome, and one thumb is speak louder. Okay. I was a designer and studio head at a consultancy called IDEO in London and San Francisco, and I guess we did what we call human-centered, people-centered design, and accessibility was part of that. Certainly inclusion was a strong part of that, but in different ways on different projects. Just to give you one example, we designed a mobile phone for Vodafone in the early noughties. It was called Simply, and it was aimed at people in their 40s and 50s who weren't adopting, or if they had bought, were not using. That was more Vodafone's motivation. Mobile phones at the time, this is pre-smartphone. And yeah, I think we had a sort of tagline borrowed from Steve Jobs of trying to design a mobile phone for the rest of us. And yeah, I think that makes me think of that line of William Gibson's about the future being already here, but just not very evenly distributed. And there was certainly felt that there was an element of that, looking at the inclusion and engagement with mobile communication at that kind of time, the turn of the millennium. So of course there were some accessibility issues in a traditional sense on the project. It's interesting, I'm now at the age where I'm doing what all our interviewees were doing at the time we were interviewing. I take my glasses on and off all the time, and so not only was clear typography and legibility important, but also an acknowledgement that most of the time you only had one hand for the phone because the other was manipulating your glasses at the same time. So that those kind of complex issues were part of the project. But it wasn't just about typeface, even though we commissioned a bespoke typeface for the phone with these very, see this kind of dates the project, doesn't it? This is the screen resolution, and it was buttons and cursors and things. But a lot of it was cultural as well. It was expressing the interface in ways that made sense to people who weren't particularly into mobile phones. And even organising it on that basis, so organising it in terms of how people thought about what they wanted to interact with rather than how it was organised within the phone. So we had, for example, we had all modes of communication organised by person. So rather than going somewhere for your voicemails in the interface and somewhere else for your texts, all those things would be grouped together under the person that they were involved with. And that seemed to make a lot more sense to this group of people than those who were quite comfortable with that part of their communication into the way that the phone thought about the world, if I can put it that way. But then, with this particular group, there was quite a lot of sort of anxiety. There were quite a lot of almost psychological accessibility issues rather than direct physical accessibility. So we ended up dedicating an entire dedicated button at the top left-hand corner of the phone just to get you out of menus if you felt like you got lost and you couldn't get back. And actually that was more about the reassurance than the literal navigation. That seemed really important. We had too many people with their existing phones that they'd actually have to resort to switching it on and off and on again to get out of the nth layer of menu that in those days mobile phones dictated that you ended up navigating. And then for me, the really interesting one, and the one that I guess starts to touch on the nuances of accessibility, was there was a very strong fear of social embarrassment. There were very significant in the lives of the people we were interviewing anecdotes about their phone or a friend of theirs' phone embarrassing them in social situations by ringing inappropriately. And at this point in time, the trouble was that you had to sort of dive down into that labyrinthine Byzantine menu structure, get 4 levels deep, and understand that the word profiles was where you were going to find a setting that enabled you to switch the ringer off. And so a lot of the people we were talking to didn't even know that function existed on their phone, and as a result of that, the only surefire way they had to make sure that their phone didn't embarrass them was to switch it off altogether, which was not great news for our client. And yeah, this was a commercial project, so we were being paid to design a phone that people would keep switched on and use and generate revenue for Vodafone. At this point, there's a connection across to another project we were doing in our spare time at IDEO at the time, called Social Mobiles, which was a very different type of project. It was what's often described as a critical design project. We were very interested in the issue of the antisocial use of mobile phones and the way that, again, round about this turn of the millennium, mobile phones were becoming more ubiquitous, and so they were becoming more influential in all of our experiences of public spaces. And it was always other people's mobile phones that were to blame, of course, because we were often genuinely inadvertent about unaware of the disruption we're causing to others. So we did this project called Social Mobiles, which was a satirical collection of 5 phones, each of which changed their users' behaviour in more or less subtle ways to make it less socially disruptive. So I'm here on London Bridge using a phone that requires quite a public performance to dial a number. And what you can't hear is there's a cacophonous chorded sound, not unlike the bagpipes actually, comes out the horn there, that's based on the DTMF dialing tones of the time. And the kind of idea behind this is that if it feels inappropriate to do this, then it's probably inappropriate to make a call. You wouldn't stand up in a cinema and make a call on this phone, or in a restaurant. You'd need to be somewhere fairly noisy and where you weren't going to disrupt people. So the act of dialing is acting as a litmus test for whether it's appropriate to make a call. We had other even less subtle phones in the series. There was one that gave you electric shocks, depending on how, not depending on how loud you were speaking on the phone, but how loud the other person was speaking. So there's this horrible mutually assured destruction if either of you raised your voices. And again, it was, these phones were not designed to be commercial products. although sometimes we enjoyed pretending that they were. They were there to see the discussion, and it was good actually. It seemed to work. We had a one-page article in The Economist about this very issue from the excellent science writer Tom Standage, who was their technology correspondent. And probably even more to the point, the project was hanging around in our studio space at the same time that we were working with Vodafone. So it was, although it was tangential, it was this nice reminder, little provocation each time they were in our studios about just how important etiquette was, particularly to this group that we were designing for. And so the final phone, for all its other flaws, it had something that I'm still quite proud of. We had a little switch on the side of the phone that could switch the ringer off directly. And not only did you not have to dive into all those menus, but you could just have a little look at the switch, while the phone was still in your handbag or your pocket, or you feel for it, just to check, probably 10 times a minute in sensitive circumstances. And yeah, I'd like to argue that's an accessibility feature. It certainly felt that way to the people we were designing with and for. And yeah, and it's kind of, I think it's amazing that it's still on smartphones, even with the richer and in many ways more direct interaction that they support. Okay, so back to Dundee. Obviously, in my role as a teacher of undergraduates in design, one of the things I'm passionate about is to introduce them to the broader issues of accessibility. I'm not an accessibility expert. If you don't realise that by now, I'm sure I'm going to make it clear with something I'll say very soon. But yeah, to get our undergraduate students to embrace the idea of inclusion. And I mean, it's something we're all wrestling with, so it's really tough for students who are still engaging with and developing as designers to take it forward. So the approach I've followed down the years has often been this, to actually get them to start with an individual rather than a population. And so I've run a module called Objects for Grand People, where a whole class of interaction and product designers just pick one older person rather than designing for older people as a group, because conversations that are framed in that way tend to descend into stereotypes really early on. Each of the students picks one of their grandparents, or if they don't have access to one, or that there's no longer a grandparent alive, a friend of the family of the same generation, and they work with them, and they understand them, and they bring them back to the studio metaphorically, and so the class as a whole learn about the diversity of people in that age group collectively. They learn about the diversity of each other's grandparents, but then they design individually for those grandparents, and that leads to a project where accessibility becomes part of the project rather than swamping the entire project and being the entire reason for doing it. So this is Despina, and she's a seamstress in Athens in her 80s at the time of this project, and she's the grandmother of Mike, who was an interaction design student in his second year back in 2009 when this particular instance of the project was run, and he's now gone on to really great and interesting things. He went on to the Royal College of Art and is now a designer and a researcher and an entrepreneur down in London. And I'll talk a little bit more about what else he's gone on to do and how this might have influenced him. But first of all, I'm going to show a film that's online. Actually, before I do that, so Microsoft have an interesting portal about inclusive design. They've got a group there that's that's championing it within the company, and they commissioned a film called Inclusive the Film that I'm just going to show you. We've got time for 10 minutes of it, haven't we?
It's a much more time to talk.
Yeah. I'll switch the microphone off and I'll ask Kevin how long he wants me to talk for. Yeah, we'll go to this. So from the beginning would be. So I think Mike and Despina do a very good job of explaining the project in their own words. But this is available online if you want to go back and revisit it. The URL, I think there's a more complicated one, but you can type in www.inclusivethefilm.com. All one word, if I can put it that way. And that gets you to this site, but you then have to scroll down to the bottom right-hand corner to find the film itself these days, because they've populated with lots of other things in the meantime.
Sorry, I can't actually see the screen.
Titles appear over soft colors that sharpen into images. Microsoft Design, in partnership with Cinema, presents a Liao Wang film. A figurine plays a violin.
Excuse me while I saw this, sorry.
I'll turn the volume up as well.
In a black and white photo, a smiling young woman with short dark hair wears sunglasses. A vase contains white flowers. An elderly woman marks fabric with chalk. Several dozen spools display colored thread. Sitting at a manual sewing machine, the woman pushes repeatedly on the treadle with one foot, rocking it back and forth as she feeds fabric under the presser foot. The needle moves up and down. A title, Inclusive. Interaction designer Mike Vanis converses with a woman, his grandma, in Greek. Subtitles appear as they speak. Mike Vanis: do you remember when you used to work with Anna? Grandma: yes. Mike: now you are on your own. Grandma: I have to admit that I miss her company, but Anna has kids and family and has to stay at home. Mike: I remember the different sounds of the workshop. Anna was doing the ironing. All these sounds were very nice. Grandma: indeed, it was company. It's nice to work with someone you know. Mike and his grandma sit in the living room together. Scenes of grandma sewing appear. A pincushion sits on a table. Thread extends through the needle. Grandma carefully pins a piece of fabric in place. Decorative letters on the sewing machine spell Vesta. Mike: we were asked to make a project about the future of working and focus on how older people work. What they told us to do, though, which is not common, is to make a design for just one person of our choosing. So I chose you. Grandma: aw, you make me really happy. In a city, pedestrians crowd a busy street. An aerial view shows Athens, Greece. Buildings form dense clusters around a hill that serves as the home of the Parthenon. Mike and his grandma climb a circular staircase.
So normally, as a designer, when you're involved in a project that has a lot of research with people, you want to make sure that you capture a large variety of people so that you can get everyone's idiosyncrasies. But actually, in this project, it's slightly different.
They visit a dressmaker's workshop. They exchange kisses with the proprietor. Grandma: hello, how are you? Let me introduce you my grandson. Hello, Mikhail, how are you? Grandma: let me show you this room. The tables are on the other side. Mike: were you sitting in a different area? Grandma: no, we were all together around here. We used to be 40 girls. Mike: 40 girls? Grandma: 40 girls.
We had to go and pick one person, in our extended family, and talk to them and really understand what work means to them, how they're coping with not working after their retirement.
Mike's grandma sews.
just the sounds of the sewing machines was complex enough to bring back those memories, to really create a feel for the environment and to replicate it. Because a lot of the time the way they would work is they would stay completely quiet and not talk to each other, but they could hear each other's sewing machines, they could hear each other's sounds.
Mike sets 2 small sewing machine replicas next to his grandma's machine. A small wheel on the side, resembling a sewing machine's stop-motion wheel, spins. Mike, here we have 2 small sewing machines. Now imagine that each of these represents one of your friends. Every time they press the pedal on their machine at home, this one moves and does the exact same thing. And it has the same sound as her sewing machine. If, for example, she's making curtains, then the sound is very long. Grandma, this is so nice. I really miss that company, to be honest. Mike, that's why I did this project, to remind you of the period that you were sewing together. It's my honor.
Ti mimo po mo kaya siya titinigay. Prosora. Ti mimo.
Inclusive design is about considering the full range of human diversity.
Jutta Trevoranis Inclusive Design Research Center.
It's both an attitude and it's a...
So that's Jutta Trevoranis. I'm sure some of you know of her. We'll come back to her later. I'm just realising there's another bit that Mike talks about that must be at the end of the film, because the film is nicely bookended by Mike and Despina's project. So I think I'd forgotten that the other bit is right at the end. Let's see if we can... Bear with me, sorry about this. Oh, there again. Okay, I'll just play it from here. It's only a couple of minutes, but there's a nice bit.
Smarter, so they have a choice as to what works best for them.
At the playground with Susan Goldsman.
You involve the public right from the beginning. You don't have a design before you walk into the public. But that doesn't relieve you of the responsibility to be innovative and creative, because the public can only give you ideas. They're not going to come up with the way in which you translate those ideas. That's not their job, that's your job.
Mike Vanis and his grandma hold hands as they enter a room with several dress forms clad in garments. Grandma fixes a ruffle on a white gown. Graham Pullin.
The role of the designer is an active part of that partnership, and it's as much for them to bring their idiosyncrasies and sensibilities to the table as it is to facilitate that inclusion. The heart of interaction design is not our interaction with technology, it's our interaction with each other through technology. It's not about us and objects, it's about us and each other.
Grandma, let's drink our coffee now together. Cheers. Mike, cheers. I made the coffee again. Cut to black. Credits.
Sorry. I'll just know. So I got that wrong as well, because I think I must have missed it. There's another really nice quote from Mike that must have occurred just after as we left the film in the first place. But it's here. I transcribed it because it was so nice. So yeah, Mike's on film saying if you start with the person, then this really amazing thing happens where they dictate the technology. You come to surprises, you arrive at a place where the technology and the person feel so close and so intimate that you don't actually see the technology anymore. So that's, I think that's the, goodness me, what an aspiration for those of us designing with technology and for and with people. So that was a second year project for Mike, and so obviously just, you know, a formative part of his education. I think it's quite interesting as to where he went next. His degree show project was this. It's an object called Acoustic Poetry, and the final year projects of our students are totally self-directed and self-conceived. They're not, the tradition within an art college is not to have supervisors putting up projects for students to do, but the students, you know, do whatever they want on the basis of their interests, but also their career aspirations. And so Mike did this project called Acoustic Poetry, and it was looking at soundscapes and hearing impairment. So acoustic poetry ended up being a little box that someone who was profoundly deaf could carry with them, particularly when travelling and on holiday, and have some way of experiencing the soundscapes they were part of, as well as the visual environment. And the way it worked was that the box was opened to harvest the soundscape, and then that was sent by a mobile phone link to someone who would describe the sounds back. But that person was a poet. It wasn't just someone who could hear. It was someone who could hear and then write a very evocative description of that soundscape. And so not just the information, but the way that was presented and the way that was framed, and the experience of that information was a really important part of the project. Mike's gone on to lots of other things since graduating in 2011, and yeah, they're not all about accessibility as such, but there's nearly always an element of that. So he worked at a company called Technology Will Save Us, which was involved with the BBC and the Microbit initiative, designing and distributing a small programmable circuit board to get 12-year-old kids in schools throughout the UK engaged with computing in the 21st century. So, you know, computing with a physical element to it, physical computing. And he's co-founded with his design partner Cindy Strobach a company called Unit Lab, and they do a lot of work in terms of public engagement and in particular schools engagement with science. But he's also a sort of card-carrying designer in the digital design community in London, and so, you know, at the same time as doing those other things, he's just opened they've just opened an exhibition at the London Design Festival this week. We were Skyping into this from the studios in Dundee on Tuesday, called Water, and that's pretty much the brief for the exhibition. They've invited some really interesting and thoughtful and exploratory designers to just respond to the theme of water, and they've got an exhibition that's curated in a gallery in Peckham somewhere at the moment as we speak. And I think the reason I'm showing you that is, again, I think it speaks of the fact that he's, you know, his experience of that module he's not become an accessibility expert, or that's not the focus of his career, but it's still part of a career that is just as open-minded and open-ended as it ever has been. But it's a really important element. And he's also now working at the Interaction Research Studio, which is a really interesting group. For any of you who don't know it, it was founded by Bill Gaver at Goldsmiths. It's still at Goldsmiths, but they do some really interesting work that combines both technology and collaborative participatory ethnography and design. And this is I guess this is an extreme example, but a nice example. They did a project with a community of Poor Clare nuns, where they this object here is called the Prayer Companion, and it streams news feeds into what is an isolated order. This was obviously in collaboration with the nuns themselves. This isn't something that was forced upon them as an intervention, in terms of giving them an insight into the world around them that their vows preclude them from participating actively in, if that makes sense. And so really, very obviously a deeply cultural project, but one again that has a different slant, that makes some connection with accessibility, I would argue. And yeah, you saw her briefly on the video. I think if we'd have carried on for a few minutes, Jutta was going to say diversity is the world's greatest asset and inclusion is our biggest challenge. And I think that's nice, the way that she groups those two things together. You could do it the other way around, couldn't you? That the punchline is that diversity is an asset. And I think that's very inspiring for those of us working in this area. Okay, how are we doing for time? Yeah. So I'll speed up a bit now. I think I've always been interested in the relationship between ability and identity. In the book that I wrote exploring the relationship and often the gap between disability-related design and design in general, there's a chapter about simplicity and universality, and that sort of irony that sometimes paring something down and making it do less can make it more accessible, even though it's then almost by definition less things to all people, if that makes sense. Those things are in an interesting and sometimes really creative tension, but also a very interesting relationship between ability and identity. And I think the thing I like about the project that Mike and Despina did together was that there were accessibility issues there, and I guess at the heart of it is Despina's mobility impairment. The reason she no longer shares the atelier with her friends is that she can't get across town. She can't travel daily to that environment, and so. But then the project is actually more about her identity than it is about her ability, and the fact that she's still a seamstress, even though she's sewing alone these days, and that identity is a collective one. It's co-created with her fellow seamstresses, and we've explored other projects. This is a project which I won't have time to talk to you about, but about hearing impairment and making environments more inclusive through furniture, as well as wearable devices. But looking at the culture around deafness and recognizing the difference it is to embrace deafness with a capital D than just hearing impairment, and how that can influence and inspire design work. And on that project, we looked beyond the objects themselves to the signage that might alert people to the presence of it. And again, very briefly, sorry to touch on it so flittingly, but looking at how this kind of technology could be represented in terms of the conversation it would support, rather than in terms of ears with lines through them, or something that referred to the impairment that it was there to address. And I think that's something that, again, a couple that write about this very deeply and actually very provocatively. If you don't know them, Liz DePoy and Stephen Gilson at the University of Maine, and they have a really thought-provoking book called Branding and Designing Disability, which is about the way that disability is not just defined but also represented is an interesting double-edged sword. And so they're actually pushing back on some of the traditional notions of inclusion and accessibility. So that's an inaccessible slide. Sorry about the contrast on this one. It says accessibility and identity, but this time there's a star next to identity because we're thinking about identity in a different connotation in terms of that of brand and company. So here's an interesting initiative called the Inclusive Fashion and Design Collective. You can find at inclusivecollective.org, and on the front page of their website, they've got a nice statement of intent. This is what equity means to the Inclusive Fashion and Design Collective. Beautiful, functional, sustainable products, genuinely listening to the wants and needs of people with disabilities and questioning the status quo. So it's being self-consciously set up as a disruptive influence in the world of fashion and design. The person behind it, or one of the people behind it, but very much the instigator is Liz Jackson, also known as the girl with the purple cane, which has had a very interesting. You can find this readily online. She's had a campaign going and a very interesting interaction with J. Crew in the States, the retailers. Putting pressure on them publicly in a conversation that has been, that is publicly aired, as to why they won't stock walking canes alongside the clothing and other items in their stores. And I think it's interesting because it's obviously we're willing for her to succeed, but even that conversation is so illuminating, and it's having influence in itself because she's publishing the interactions with the company and putting them online. And then back to the Inclusive Fashion and Design Collective. This again is this is the first screen you hit, and they've got a picture here. Which is nicely kitsch actually, and deliberately so. It's very knowingly art directed, but there's a glamorous woman in a fur coat and a walking cane hailing a cab in New York, and if you hover on the image, the alt text says, "We aren't sure why beautiful imagery has such dull descriptions. The IFDC is searching for talented and creative writers who are interested in turning image descriptions into works of art. Poets, children's book authors, novelists, rappers, and lyricists immediately come to mind. If you are interested in describing this photograph, will you reach out to hello@inclusivecollective.org?" And I'm sure everyone in the audience can think of even better examples of this, but for someone who isn't immersed in your field as much as you are yourselves, I thought this was really refreshing. This was, taking something that was a problem that had to be fixed and kind of turning it on its head and seeing it as much a part of the brand and the vision of the company and the collective as the image in the first place. The image has been very highly art directed, unknowingly so. So why not the description as well? So that seemed entirely fitting. I also think it's interesting. It kind of reminds me of Mike Varnas's Acoustic Poetry. It's not just about the information about how what noises you can hear in an environment. It's how they're described. That's because you're trying to create an And the other thing that's interesting about the inclusion and the inclusive design, fashion and design collective is that they're actually very industry facing at the same time. As they're inclusive, and so the brand is there for wearers. It has a very inclusive and democratic feel, but they know that a really important part of their audience are the brands that they might influence. You know, people like J. Crew, that, as I've said, Liz Jackson is already deeply in conversation with. And so there's the statement about who they are and what they're there for continues in other terms. It says, that statement about this is what equity means to the inclusive fashion and design collective. They say your brand discovering the benefits of designing for the exception, your brand reaping the rewards of marketing to diverse communities. So they're facing the existing fashion world as well as the people who are ill-served by that world, trying to influence both. And I mean, this is something that, again, is a really important part of design education in most disciplines. And so, you know, it's about realizing that, you know, brand isn't about a logo or applied to an object or a service. It needs to run through the entire service from top to bottom, and this is an example I like that my students find it very easy to relate to as well. This is from a book about visual identities for small businesses, and it's a film school in New York called the Ghetto Film School, but the entire branding is achieved through gaffer tape. And what's nice about that is it's not just about how attractive or even memorable it is. It gets to the heart of not just the trade, but the spirit and the point of view, the attitude of this particular company. So it's something that comes from the inside out rather than is applied from the outside in. I was on a train yesterday, going to Manchester and back, and it was a Virgin train. And have you been in the toilets in Virgin trains? So that was a rather weird question to ask, wasn't it? Anyway, this one, I went in not for research purposes, and you get inside and next to all the grotty buttons with Braille on that I'm never quite sure how anyone would find, let alone risk finding. As soon as the door shut, there was a woman's voice came over the tannoy and said, "Please don't flush nappies, sanitary towels, or paper towels, gum, old phones, unpaid bills, junk mail, your ex's sweater, hopes, dreams, or goldfish down this toilet." And I don't know, so probably someone in the room, does anyone in the room know about the how that came about? I'm imagining that the trigger might have been, oh God, we've got to do an accessibility, we've got to make that signage that tells you not to flush things down the toilet that's on the toilet lid accessible. But yeah, whether or not you, I don't know. I find it a little bit trying too hard. But the least you could say is that Virgin have embraced that and kind of made that, taken ownership of it, haven't they? They've made that issue in a part of their own brand. It's a little bit heavy-handed, but it feels like that's something that they've included as part of the whole experience, which feels like a really interesting precedent. And I think I am really interested. I think brand, just as individuals can provoke new ways of thinking about things, I think it's quite interesting to actually turn the tables and exploit the idea that brands, because of their values, can also be triggers and starting points for new ways of thinking about accessibility and disability-related design in general. And so I think I'm just starting a PhD, or a student of mine is just starting a PhD looking at the design of hearing aids. And I think, again, brands could be, they're quite interesting reference points. You know, what would it be if Apple, as it's rumoured is going to happen actually, if they were to design a hearing aid, that immediately, because they have such an evocative brand, that starts a train of thought as to what that might be. Conversely, in a complementary way, if a brand like Paul Smith, these are examples taken from the book, if they were to get involved in designing hearing aids, that would be a very different direction, wouldn't it? And I think that the diversity of the directions that are indicated by different brands engaging with disability, accessibility, inclusion, diversity, I think is enriching in itself. Back to Jutta Treperanus's comment, I think, you know, there's diversity in us as people, but there's also diversity in brands, and that's a resource we can tap into actually to open up new ways of thinking. And at the moment, I'm just finishing off a pilot project looking at prosthetic hands and choice of materials. And again, our starting point is looking at what's happening in eyewear retail and design, and actually using that as a provocation. How much of that could we bring into the sphere of prosthetics, both in terms of the choice, but also in terms of the nuance, the word I used early on in the talk. So it's not about making loud statements with very flamboyant and eye-catching prostheses, but it is about the nuance of material choice and the cultural associations of eyewear that have now become so embedded in fashion that it's been appropriated by the fashion brands themselves. That's it. Thank you for listening. Oh dear, sorry, I was hoping to finish with a bit more time for questions, but
No, good time for questions.